Good morning, folks. If you're joining me here on the main stage, excited to see you here. We're going to get started here in just a minute or two. As you're getting familiar with the platform, you can see all these different tabs up at the top. You've got the chat, there's a poll there, and there's people. In that chat, you have multiple different ones. You've got a stage chat, which is the main stage here. I encourage you all to move over to that main stage chat whenever you're here in this main room. The event chat is for the entire event. That chat will remain open for the entire length of our symposium. And of course, you can always send direct private messages to any individual that you see here that you want to say hi to and get to know personally. All righty. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Science and Policy 2020 Symposium. I am Kristen Eulenbrock, and I am a part of the Institute for Science and Policy team, and it is my great pleasure to be with you here today. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to see so many familiar faces as well as some new folks joining us. And as anyone who has put together an event of this size very well knows, that it takes a village, and there are many people in that village that I do want to thank, and George and I will thank later on this afternoon. But there are two very special people that I want to acknowledge here right up top, which is my two closest colleagues and Institute team members, Trent Noss and Nicole Delaney. A huge thank you for the dedication and commitment to the Institute and all the work that they've put in to help put this together. I also want to acknowledge and thank our steering committee, Jim Marchiori, Steve Nash, Kathleen Stacks, Davi Wilson, and Carrie Wright-Platice. So what's 2020 without a whole other platform for you all to learn and to join in on? So thank you for bearing with us. With that being said, we've had the very lucky privilege of working with Verve Integrative, who's helping us sponsor this event and this platform and working with us on all of our technical challenges and needs. So if you see Verve, they're going to be in a tech help desk room in a session. If you have any tech questions, whether that's audio, video, or anything else about the platform, feel free to pop in there anytime. Verve will be in there to help you. You can also send them a chat. You can also send Nicole a chat, where she's under the Institute for Science and Policy profile, or Trent Noss or myself. We're all here to help you. And I will say my one piece of advice, of course, is that you cannot break this. So poke around, look under the hood, chime in the chat, check out one of the expo halls. Hopefully you participate in a networking coffee hour this morning. That will be there and available later this afternoon as well. This platform is really meant to be interactive throughout Tuesday, today, and Thursday, part of our sessions. I think you also saw there in the chat, if you want, we have this great reflection board. So if you want to just scroll me down, move me up to the top part of your screen, look right below my video sharing platform where you're watching me. And what you should see below me is a tablet that we're calling our reflection board. There's a little plus sign there, and you can add your thoughts and reflections throughout the day. So that is meant to be anything that you hear in day one here on Tuesday that you want to reflect upon or have a conversation on, or maybe there's an article relevant to what we're talking about. We encourage you to make that board your own and share any of your major reflections on that space throughout the day. We'll have another one there on Thursday as well. So 2020, I mean, it's the year of pandemic, right? And if there's ever been a time when science is unfolding in real time and shaping policy, and policy impacting science, it is definitely this pandemic that we're living through. And so many of you may very well know and have tuned in that we've been hosting a COVID-19 webinar series since April in partnership with the Colorado School of Public Health. I want to take just a quick moment to acknowledge that partnership, and a huge thank you to Dean Samet. Dr. John Samet has been a wonderful contributor, thought partner, and excellent friend as we've been putting on that series, which will continue into 2021. He has been working tirelessly here in the state of Colorado and beyond to help us understand this virus. He's also a huge advocate for education and sharing that knowledge. And the reason I bring up John and that COVID webinar is that just recently, one of our guests who joined us, Dr. Neil Epperson, shared the thought with us where she said, all of us just need to take a breath. It is a marathon and we've been running like it's a sprint. And so I think that piece of advice for all of us to take a breath, because we're in the middle of a really long marathon. And while we've been going really hard at certain parts of the year because it's felt like a sprint, is really relevant not only to COVID-19 and the challenges of the pandemic, but so many other wicked societal problems that we often talk about and deal with here at the Institute. And so with that, I hope all of us will take a moment to take a breath throughout these next couple days, open our minds, engage in conversation, perhaps examine our own beliefs or preconceived notions or biases, and maybe dive into some deep thinking about some of these most pressing issues that we're going to be talking about. And while many of them may seem very serious and very complex and very challenging, we hope that these next 2 days will give you just a little bit of optimism or hope or a little bit better understanding, which is why we have this beautiful theme of untangling complexity in our changing world. And so with that, I don't want to take any more time. I want to introduce and invite George Sparks to join me here on the stage. George is our endearing and inspirational leader that I'm sure so many of you are very well known and are familiar with. He's the president and CEO of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. He's the founder of the Institute for Science and Policy. And it brings me great, tremendous joy to work with George every day. And I'm so grateful for his vision and his motivation to just do good in the world. So I'm so glad to have George with me this morning. Good morning, George. How are you doing?
Good morning, Kristen. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Would you like to provide us with a few remarks to kick off our symposium?
I'd love to. Thank you, Kristen. And I want to start off with thanks as well. Kristen and her team, Trent and Nicole, are simply astonishing. I've just come to love and admire them. They've created so much value here. It also, as she said, takes a village, and the staff of the museum and the volunteers that have helped us all through the Institute process have been tremendous. 3 volunteers in particular I want to highlight, though. Mark Eddy, Jim Marchiori, and Lorez Meinhold have been there from the beginning and meet with us every single week. And I also want to thank the donors and my board who really believed in us as we started this thing. So you all remember the March for Science, which happened a few years ago, and it was about a war on science. I didn't think you could have a war on science. You could disregard science, and that usually ends badly. But could we do something beyond just marching to help? So we decided to start the Institute, and the goal was, how can science be used more effectively to create good public policy? And we took a very scientific approach and said, gosh, if they just knew what we knew, people would understand it. So it's really a communication problem. So we started focusing on scientists, journalists, and policymakers on how they can communicate more effectively with each other. And as you might imagine, it was a lot more complicated than that. So the reality of using science is you first had to get to science. And the road to science had 3 big barriers: our biases, our values, and our self-interest. Now, our biases are genetic usually and kind of learned over time early in our life. In my case, I was a kid growing up in southern West Virginia in a small coal mining town in the 50s. So I had both the genetic biases from my parents and the learned biases of what you might imagine a straight white male Baptist would have in southern West Virginia. The values that we have are learned. They can be unlearned or changed throughout our lives. When I left West Virginia at 17, my values were conservative, patriotic, religious person. And self-interest are something that's very situational. My self-interest when I left West Virginia was I wanted to get the best education possible. But these change throughout our lives. If you were an oil field worker and you got laid off and got a job as a wind engineer, you probably think differently about the energy transition, or vice versa if you went the other way. So it's very, very situational. And what we discovered is that dialogue creates trust. That's the only way that science can be applied to creating good public policy, is you have to have trust. So we decided to focus on convenings and creating trust among disparate groups of people. One of the things that we discovered about policy, and it was a big aha to me, I'm not sure why, the policy is really about power. And it's power over people or power over place. And there are lots of attributes to good policy, but we discovered a few that are important from our perspective. One is policy has to serve the common good, and at the same time, it has to create equity for groups that are not in power. That's really important. Policy has to be sustainable from a financial point of view and from an emotional or popular support point of view. And policy should be grounded in science or evidence. So with those in mind, the first couple of years we focused on climate and energy as policy areas for the Institute. And then on March 15th, we had 3 crises hit around the same time: the pandemic, the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the racial equity crisis. And Kristen mentioned the partnership with the School of Public Health. I don't think I've ever been prouder of anything in my life to watch that team and Dr. Samet pivot and put on these 22 or 23 webinars now that we've done to help educate people about something that we'd never seen before. In the United States, we had a very brief moment of unity where our national divides closed up. Everybody worked together. Dr. Fauci became a popular hero. I bought a Dr. Fauci bobblehead doll. Who would have figured that? But eventually, over the next month or so, our national fractures reemerged based around our biases, our values, our self-interest, and unfortunately, politics. So how did science fare during all of this time? Well, let's talk about the science of masks. First off, we started to don't use masks, and then we'd quietly say we want to save them for the healthcare workers. We didn't really make that loud enough, so people got the message you didn't need to use masks. And then the scientists all began doing research on masks and distancing to see how the virus spread. And eventually we said, well, no, you really should use masks, and it protects others. Well, that may not be a great selling point, though. If in our national fracture we don't have a great sense of the common good, that may not be a great selling point. And eventually now we've discovered that masks do protect others and protect you, so we all should use masks. I think we made a big mistake, though, during the mask process by both the media and the scientists, though, when we talked about, we highlighted the risk of Trump rallies not wearing masks, but we didn't take the same approach when we talked about the racial protests. There were almost 2 different things. We applied 2 different sets of values around that. So science has had its ups and downs, if you will. It's become a little politicized, as we've seen at least at the national level. I think we've done a great job in Colorado, by the way, with Governor Polis and the things that they've done. I really give our state high marks for this. And then finally, I think one of the miracles of our modern time that we have vaccines. We have 2 vaccines now ready to be approved. We have to go through the challenges of manufacturing these, distributing them, figuring out who's going to get them, prioritizing all of this. And the big unknown right now is the acceptance. Will people take the vaccine? I think there's some concern that it was maybe pushed through too quickly. I don't have that concern at all. And I would ask each one of us to think about what role we can play to help the public accept masks. And those of you that know me know that I'd like to recommend books. So if you want to read one book that talks about how the virus spread initially, how it went around the world, all about pandemics, I recommend Apollo's Arrow by Nicholas Christakis. It's a fabulous book. There will be other books that are written about the pandemic, but this will be the first, and it's a fabulous resource for all of us. So now we're talking about what happens after the pandemic. What sticks? Well, maybe working from home. I doubt if we'll ever again have all of the people in the museum working here every single day. And that's probably a good thing from a socialization point of view, traffic, pollution, etc. I think we'll go back to a slower pace of life, hopefully. Spend more time with our families. I don't think business travel will ever come back the way it was. But the big thing that I hope comes from the pandemic is the drive for racial equity. Now, in my life, I've seen lots of crises come and go around race, starting with the Watts riots when I was a junior in high school in 1965. And the way I imagine this is, as a white person, we go through these racial crises, and there's a door, and I open the door and look behind the door and go, yeah, there's some issues back there, but I'm not gonna worry about that. I'm gonna close that door. But I think with the murder of George Floyd, for me and for a lot of white people, the door was ripped off its hinges, and we can no longer ignore racial equity. At this point, even an old white guy like me kind of gets it. So in the museum here, I do believe the epiphany for me personally was that I do believe there is such a thing as institutional racism. I think we have some of it here in the museum, so we've hired coaches to help us understand that and what we can do about it, especially for the staff that work here at the museum. So I encourage each of you to start your own journey around racial equity. It's a fascinating topic. I think it'll make all of us better people and it'll make us better citizens. And if you only had to read one book around this, I would read the book called Caste, C-A-S-T-E, by Isabel Wilkerson. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and it's a fabulous book. I think it's enlightening. It's interesting. Oprah said it's the most important book she's ever read. So I think it's fabulous. So in closing, pandemics are a terrible, terrible natural disaster. 500 years ago, pandemics occurred and 90% of the people in a city would perish. And I think in today's society, we think we're really in control. And as my good friend, Dr. Kirk Johnson, who's the Smithsonian Natural History Museum CEO, likes to say, just like in baseball, nature bats last. And I think we've discovered now that nature does indeed bat last and that we're not in control. We had no playbook for this. There's lots of new science that had to be discovered, and we're inventing it as we go. And whether you're a politician, a professor, or a professor of the museum, all of us are afraid. All of us have been psychologically injured. All of us have made mistakes. So I'm suggesting that the word of the year for 2020 is grace. I think each of us should offer grace to each other. I think we should accept grace from each other, forgive others, forgive ourselves. And if we create more grace in the world, we will get through this together. So enjoy the day, enjoy the symposium, and I'll turn it back over to Kristen.